Welcome everyone. Let's start today with the identity and onboarding as a topic. So, as mentioned, we will be recording this session. There will be time for some Q&A at the end, and we'll stop the recording before that. But if you have any questions, please shoot them in the chat, and there will be people answering those questions, and we'll raise the more interesting ones in the end of the Q&A, unless you bring those up yourself. As yesterday, I am still Ari Rantalainen. I work as a solution architect at Nordcloud. You can reach me via that email address. I have more than 12 years of experience with SaaS environments, running a multi-tenant document management system for engineering and management content in the past. Been in all the roles from developer to the product owner to the product manager, running the R&D and running operations. Recently, I've been about 4 years as an AWS solution architect and trying to find those best solutions for our customers within Nordcloud. Nordcloud is a cloud consulting company. We work purely in the public cloud. Our goal is to make our customers more value and supercharging them with the world's best technology platforms, doing cloud stuff, items that work in the cloud the way it's meant to be done to have that really good impact. We are a European leader. We do cloud implementations. We do application development. We provide managed services, meaning that we will run your cloud infrastructure for you if need be. And we provide also training. So if any of those are of your interest, please contact us. We are certified across all clouds, and we have more than 1,000 professionals to help you if you have any questions or need guidance or need to know the best practices or industry standards that's going around and want to know how to do things best. At present, we are offering this hypergrowth program, which is basically you can have more details of that from the www.nordcloud.com hypergrowth AWS, which is an offering where we help you guys to find the best ways that your current or future or planned solution would be taken into AWS. 1 hour general review, then build a plan, and then help you to execute on those. For more details, check the URL. But okay, going to the real topic, identity and onboarding. Let's start with the first one, identity. So in case no one's actually paying you to keep your usernames, passwords safe from hackers, provide MFAs, validate people's identities, recover their lost passwords or reset their accounts, check that those passwords comply to some standards, manage those users, manage the groups, synchronize your system's user management with some customers' own user management systems, stay up to date on security breaches, employ all the staff and get all the resources that are required to maintain that. I definitely recommend that you take a look at some of the identity providers out there. So this is a complex area of business, and there are a lot of companies that are concentrating on that. But redoing that yourself requires quite a lot of effort, and is of course a potential area of quite a lot of risk in case your identity management would be breached. And usually in the context, if we're talking about larger players, they are so well covered, they know the risks that they will keep on those up to date, and they will work hard to have those security in place and up to speed. But then, as was mentioned, this is always almost every time something that, as we start to talk about SaaS solutions, identity, it's always there. If we talk in the full SaaS context and taking into account what I mentioned yesterday about the microservices and building those silos and building those multi-tenant solutions, the approach of this presentation, as well as probably most of the presentations that we've had here, would be on terms of trying to find the ways and to promote those multi-tenancy solutions, because it reduces the amount of R&D. You don't have to build everything for everyone. You don't have to maintain everything for everyone. You just have your universal solution, and you try to get most of that one solution, and you are then able to concentrate more on getting that best solution for your customers, instead of figuring out how do you reduce costs by doing something more efficiently. So now, as we're talking about these solutions, this identity also, mainly in the context of multi-tenant SaaS, but this talk is a lot also applicable in a siloed solution.
Can you move the mouse, please?
Yes. So the onboarding, as mentioned, that's basically the process of getting the new tenant into your system. So all the processes that goes into that, getting the accounts, getting the resources, making up everything that is required to have one environment running for that customer, creating that tenancy and creating a user in it. There you need identity. You need to know who's accessing and how. When they finally start to use your service, you need the identity to authenticate, of course, and then to authorize, to know what they can actually work with. Once you have everything running, you need to know how the customer uses your system. And you need to have compliance auditing mechanisms in some cases. You need to be able to figure out what goes wrong. So for everything of those, you need to know also, as well as the customer or the end user, you need to know also the tenant context. So what is the tenancy that they're working with, which tenant that they are operating on. In order to isolate the tenants from each other, you need to have some kind of management system, or you need to manage it somehow, how the resources are isolated from each other. And then, of course, this also drives, you need to know which tenant data silos or data stores that you are accessing, or how do you access the data. So identity is there everywhere. Identity of the user, identity of the context of in the context of the tenant. So that sort of reveals the next point, that we have the user identity. We know that user identity is an account, is a person, which has some information, first name, last name, phone number. But then within SaaS, we have to start thinking about the different kind of identity. We have to start first with the user identity. So as mentioned, there are multiple identity providers. Taking a look at this is just a couple of the most common. And with the recent acquisition of Auth0 by Okta, there is unfortunately one less, but there is still plenty to go around. Cognito works as an excellent identity provider for customer environments, or for your multi-tenancy SaaS. So once you combine your user identity with that tenant identity, so in order to get you this tenant context, then we can start talking about the person's SaaS identity, basically combining all of that, adding to the user identity, adding the tenancy information, the company name, the billing tier or your service levels, all that status, meaning like discontinued or active. So that combines you with the SaaS identity. So that, as an identity concept, now identifies both user and the tenant. So it's secured in the identity provider's context if you use this or combine these, and you can use this in the OAuth flows, the OpenID connects that you want. Even in some contexts, it'll work. So it's part of all of that. So then, as you have these, as the customers are using your services, if you have the solutions to go here is that you as you build your service, you have a customer coming in or an end user coming in. As they come in, you do the query that who is this customer? What's the tenancy tenant that they belong to? So you have a tenant microservice and you do lookups. All of that is how would I put it? A bit slow usually. External microservices calling external microservices usually causes a network call, which is always a bit slow. And if you have to do that multiple times, it becomes a problem. So as we're talking about the OAuth and OpenID Connect mechanisms or protocols to identify people, we're talking about JWTs. And in those, it's possible to embed that tenant context. So then instead of doing lookups, you already have that information inside, which provides then a very quick way inside the service to verify, to extract the information, and then use it according to find your way around your service and around the data that needs to be accessed. So in a normal identity management or normal web app without the concept of a SaaS identity. So just having user identity. You have your user, he tries to access your web application. So since in this context, then as you're using some identity provider, you're already redirected there. The user is denied access, he doesn't have the required tokens, he's directed to the identity provider. He logs in there, is given some credentials or some token from the identity provider. He then with that is redirected back to your web app. That then calls an application service carrying that identity with it. But now the application service needs to figure out who is this, or which tenant this person is part of, so that they know to provide the right data. So they need to do this call to the tenant manager to see the tenant management service to see that what is the tenant ID in order for me to call the database to figure out where I should go. We need the tenant context. Then the application service needs to call another application service for further information. Let's assume so. That application service now, as we discussed yesterday, is an isolated service of its own. It holds its own context. It is independent. So it needs also now, it's passed the user identity is passed, so it also needs to know what's the tenancy of this user. So it does the call for the tenant management service. And with that, we've found the bottleneck of our system. This tenant management service, for all the requests that's coming in, is going to be hit multiple times. Of course, you can scale things up, but usually scaling internal service to a high level or high accessibility is not the way to go. But it's causing usually the bottleneck in your system. So this is also a possible route to go, but there would be a better one. So talking about this SaaS identity. So the same thing happens. We have the user, he accesses your web app, he's directed to the identity provider. The identity provider returns tokens. Those tokens are then sent back to the web app. And at this time, in that SaaS identity, or in this case, in the ID token that is being passed from the identity provider, now, if you remember a couple of slides back, I was talking of adding that tenant context, tenant IDs, tenant information into the mix. So in that token, in the ID token, we now have the information about which tenant this is. So now the web app, the front end, your front end calls your backend services, and there they already know what the tenant is because it's part of that ID token. So instead of calling an external service at this point, to get the tenancy, it already knows it. It needs to request something from another service. It can just pass on the token again to the other service, which then can decompose that ID token to figure out that what is the tenancy here. So no need for tenant management services. Everything is already retrieved from the identity provider or the metadata that is stored in the identity provider. And that's all passed through the header calls of those services. And we are avoiding building another lookup service, and we are avoiding external calls for all those services, application services. So for those who are familiar with OAuth and JOTS, there's nothing new here, but just as a reminder, so when we identify ourselves or get the authentication or authorization from the identity providers, we are given back tokens which are part of that JOT. So there is the ID token and access token, and these are in most cases just one token actually, which is sent back, but the fields are then intermixed or merged. And then in those, the fields here are basically called claims, and you can have in those claims, you can have a lot of information, and you can tie there also your custom claims, like tenant ID. This is all OpenID Connect and OAuth standard access mechanisms, standards, and in those actually it's just defined that some of these fields are recommended, but not compulsory that much. So you are able to add new claims here, add new fields, add new information into those tokens, which might be those tenant IDs, statuses, tiers, and so forth. All of these tokens are sent in that one authorization header as part of your headers. It's a JOT token that is encrypted and signed via the standards. So you have a public key encryption there. The beginning of the token basically tells you which algorithms to use to read it. You also know where to retrieve those public keys, and in order to see that it is also signed and secure. So you are able on your side of things decrypt and verify that this is truly coming from the identity provider, so you know that you can trust it. And the data that's in there, you can trust that data as well. And all this is transferred, of course, via the over TLS so HTTPS. So there is, I would say it's very difficult to get yourself in the middle and be having a identity token which would be compromised, at least on the route. There may be, if the source system is compromised, then of course that's a slightly different thing. But then the problem is quite large if you're using an external identity provider. So within that identity provider, this example is from Cognito. So you now have you have the basic information in Cognito, but then you also have the capability of adding that tenant information, your service levels, your company information, and so forth. So this is how it looks in Cognito. You can add those custom attributes. You can define how they look and what are the data types. And then once you take a look at those in the data of the customer, and this is basically the content on the JOTS as well, you'll see that the custom fields will be delivered as part of that token. So as this is being sent from the server to the client to your backend, you will always have a secure way of knowing and direct way of knowing just by the token that is being carried over, that who is this person, what is the tenant that they belong to, and some of the data that you want to manage in the identity provider, like for example the tier of the tenant. So now that this helps in terms that as you're getting that token, the isolation, you're getting that token from Amazon Cognito. As said, your microservice is then reading that token, validating that it's coming from the right place, checking that the signature is okay. And within the tenant context, it then knows to ask from IAM that what is the access of this? Where is it able to go? And which role is you are assigning to it in IAM? And with that, then you're able to access those resources which hold that isolated data. So having that information already in the token helps you instead of getting that token or that information on route. When you're picking up Cognito as your identity provider, there is some limitations on how you work with that. So one way of there is Cognito has these user pools and identity pools, and as you are working with your building your own service and you want to have your the users managed somewhere, that's when you pick up user pools as for your use. So that's where you define the users. There is the user pools will provide you with mechanisms on signing in and taking care of forgotten passwords, etc. But then when you start to build your user pools, you have to start thinking about, are you going to use separate user pools for each tenant or one large user pool? Well, the big thing there is that if you're running with separate user pools themselves will have configuration. Like, for example, I think the most common example here would be, would there be an MFA or not? That is something that you set by you on a user pool level. So it gives you different kinds of options that you have to then, or you are able to give that flexibility, more service to some people, more service to other customers. But if you do that, then you have to then figure out how in your service you map those people logging in to specific user pools, because user pool is the only place where they know or can authenticate this person. So it's good that you can set your own configuration, provide a more accurate or more precise service to your customers as they want it, and you can better isolate those tenants from each other because they are totally in different user pools. But then you have to build that mapping service. You have to have that on your front page before you authenticate that person. You have to figure out somehow, is this going to user pool A or user pool B? And of course, the maintenance scale of having multiple user pools is a bit daunting. You have I think it was yesterday mentioned that someone is running 1,500 tenants in their environment, or silos in their environment. If there's 1,500 user pools, there's a lot of searching already. How do I find the right guy from the right place? And this is not strictly, well, this is a potentially overflow as well, but because of the mapping, it gives you a bit of a twist there. The other option is to go with one large user pool. Everyone's belongs to that user pool. Gives you that negative side that you can't give those custom policies. You can't provide that specific service for one tenant from another. You can't enable MFA for one tenant and have access without the MFA for another. And then, of course, everyone is pulled together, so the isolation is a bit, well, based on your application, it's of course good. But then telling that story to the customer and saying that if you would be saying that they would be in the same, all users are in the same place, it would be a slightly more tricky story. But then you don't have to do that mapping. You are within the basic OAuth flow. If you take any blog post that describes you how do you want to implement OAuth flows, it'll fit. So then this is something that you have to think about in your solution. How would you go about and do this? Having separate user pools, which could be on a tenant level, which it can be a lot. You could also have multiple user pools, like for example, for tier level, but the same problem still exists. You have to find a way to map that user who's trying to log in before he enters his password. So before you send the password to the user pool for identification, you have to figure out to which one you're going to send that. So there's something to think about when considering your approach. If you would be using separate user pools per tenant, you basically have this user who is trying to log in. You are authenticating. You sort of fall into the first level into an authentication manager service of sorts. The person enters their username and password into your front end. You're basically asking now some external environment that give me this mapping. What is this user? What tenant does he belong to? What is the configuration that I need to apply to this user before I try to identify? And then once you know which user pool you're working with, then you send that information forward to that identity provider to get, or in this case, the right Cognito user pool for that authentication. So this is, these mechanisms are possible, and you just have to sort of try to find the balance between those pros and cons. Okay, so then talking about onboarding. So with onboarding, as mentioned before, we are talking about the process of getting that new user, new customer of yours to be a tenant and to have some user in the system. There's multiple places where you can provide self-service onboarding, which means that they basically register, say that I want to start using this. Fully automated, as it says here, where you can have mechanisms that start doing everything that's on the back end needs to be done. You might have some free tier, you are providing some first level of service, you start this timer basically saying that within 30 days this is still possible to use, and then you have mechanisms of then contacting those end users to say that and that thank you, were you interested in, did you find value in this? Let's talk about how would you like to go forward. But then you should also have mechanisms where you as a provider are able to create those accounts. But one thing to remember here is that you want this to be basically the same on the back end. You don't want to start building, once again, customizations to do things one way or another way. If it's ever helpful for you, or if it's something that you want to scale, you would like to have this to be automated and as uniform as possible, so that you don't at some point start to wonder, was this created by our support, or was this created by themselves, in order to find out how the account is different and why we are providing this and that service, or that and that feature isn't working because of some things that wasn't initiated as the accounts were created. So a fully automated self-sign onboarding service might be looking something like this. So you have this registration, basic information. You select thing or provide that metadata. The system then tells you, "Thank you, you have been registered. Please wait for your initial accounts." You get that validation email. Then on the back end, before the email is sent, you of course create that email. You start to create items or those resources which are required. You provide that login information. That person has now temporary password. They go in and are able to reset or set their own password, so that they know that this is secure, and not, if someone has captured that email, they are not able to access the system on their behalf already. So now thinking, this is how it looks like to the tenant user, the one that signs in for the first time. But what actually happens on the back end? So someone creates that initial, or fulfills that initial registration form. After that, the request comes to the registration backend. Things start to happen. This is basically an orchestration service, or what could be. Of course, there are multiple ways, but this I think would be a quite good solution, that you have this orchestration service. Someone says, "I want to register." You start to do actions in your system. As a first thing, you might want to create the tenancy, the basic configuration of the tenant. You have the company name, you have the tier. They want to have the free tier. You want to have the primary contact information maybe, but the most key thing of all that this will create is the tenant ID. The thing that you will then tie in the user, you will tie all the actions, everything ties into that. So that's why you have to, you probably would like to create this as the first step after the registration has started. After that, you call your user management service. You have the credentials from that registration page. You have the email, you have the first name, last name. You apply them maybe here or here, and then maybe in the tenant management as well as the person who did that registration. But here you need that administration account, so you already need that information. So with your user management, you store something in here which has that tenant information, but you'll also call the identity provider. You provide that information, for example, about the user pool. That would be your user management deciding on, are we going to put this in pool A or B? So is it the pool according to the tiers, or is it pool according to the tenants? However you want to do that. You provide that information, you create the admin user, and you store that tenant ID into the identity provider. At the same time, or after that, you start to create those isolation policies. So you have in IAM, you create the roles, you figure out what are the accesses required. Then as one of those key things, of course, would be billing. How do you want to charge the customer? And you have to start. You'll start those processes in play, and then most likely create some kind of a account or to your billing provider. Send that initial trial of $1 invoice to a credit card holder so that you can identify that they do have a valid credit card, which actually has some balance on it. And then now you've collected all that information from billing provider. You might get some additional information that you want to store either in the tenant management or even as tags when you're provisioning those resources for your end user or for that tenancy. So this is basically now setting up the environment for your new tenant. This is what happens on the back end. Of course, you would have some other, but I think this is the core items that you want to have there. So as we already mentioned, so as a slight recap, the tenant management service takes care of that tenant configuration, checks that has metadata related to the tenant, like the state, active, inactive. Any tenant level authentication settings stored there, anything that's related to configuration that is specific to that tenant, not to a user, but to that tenant. Then you have the billing management. You have you create your mechanisms there, something that you would be quite interested in getting to work, and after as a third service, you have the user management. You manage your administrative users or create those, and in that through that user management service that you will build, you'll then populate the identities in the identity provider and have that connection with your system. And then in that tenant provisioning phase, you actually start to create those resources. If you're running on EC2s, you start to create those networks, EC2 instances, databases. Running on serverless, you start to create anything that you feel that you need to pre-provision, like for example, once again, databases or S3 buckets to store the data that is being sent, so that everything is ready for those first requests. And of course, you'll create those routes that, depending on, of course, how you configure your system, how they are able to access. Maybe you have Route 53 subdomains for each tenancies, and that's part of this tenant provision. So then your tiering, how do you want to go there? It's also something that you need to think about in your onboarding mechanisms. So as we yesterday discussed, and I mentioned earlier today, what you want to do in many of the SaaS situations is you want to minimize the maintenance work, the operations which are related to running your service, and provide and spend your time in providing more of that of those unique selling points to your customers, those new features that separate you from your customers and are the ones that the customers actually want, or sorry, separate them you from your competitors, of course, but are the features that your customers, why they have selected you, and making better service out of that. So in order to provide you most time to do that, you want to have as little maintenance work as possible. If you're running this in a multi-tenant, so pooled tenants, or in a multi-tenant environment, you usually are able to run this simpler and with smaller overhead. But the whole key here is that you would use that one same solution, one same code base to provide all of your tenants. But in some cases, as mentioned in context of those microservices, there are needs that you have to have it siloed. There are compliancy needs. There are business cases where you just can't have those the services or resources in the same pool. And then you have to start thinking about your silos. Your silos, you can all in your onboarding, as you're creating those, basically you want to have that to be automated as well. And this is why we have this AWS code pipeline here. So you have some code base, you might have some configuration that you're able to throw in as you start onboarding. And with that configuration, you create the specific customer-specific environment, or then hopefully you don't have a configuration and you just create out of that code base, you create separate siloed environments automatically, so that every environment, apart from how the data is there, is basically a clone of each other, helping you then in problems of when the system doesn't function as well as it was, or when you want to do upgrades, knowing how to do migrations and all that maintenance work. And yes, as repetition, do not start, or it's recommended that you don't go into customization that heavily. You can have this automated, you can have mechanisms that you have, as said, one code base, pulling some code from, or some configuration settings from places, and then building that environment, or building those containers that the customer will be, or tenant will be running, and building those separately. But then you will have different environments. Hopefully the configurations could be just that is it now running in London or Frankfurt or Milan or Stockholm, when running in Europe. Or it can be then that you enable some features and disable some, but that of course then starts to deviate your system from your golden standard, and might make things, or might make the maintenance a bit more difficult. But even though, just always remember to do that, or try to do that in an automated way as possible, in a similar way as possible for all mechanisms, so that you have a system that is pretty like for each tenant. So then the maintenance and problem solving and development of new functionalities is easier, because you know one on top of which you will be implementing and what you are maintaining. So, starting to sum this up, identity and onboarding, crucial things in your SaaS environments. Don't try to do identity yourself, basically the identity management, unless you really know what you're doing. Usually there are a lot of problems that can be found. Storing your usernames and passwords, or hashes of those passwords, are always problematic, to say the least, in terms of security, in terms of accesses from your administrative users, or even the customer's administrative users. So outsourcing that to an external party is usually a good way to go. In that identity, in those identity providers, push that information which you need for each of the users as you are trying to figure out the data that they have, or the context that they work in. Try to push that all the way into the identity provider's context, so that you don't have to do lookups within your service. Because if you do lookups per request, that's going to be a lot of lookups for each person. there's always a limit on how much data you can store in an identity provider's custom field. So try to be sort of conservative about what you put there, but put at least that information which reduces creating a new service for that, or something that would be hammered all the time. So try to have that context within the identity provider's metadata. And if that identity information is coming from those from the identity providers and those JOTs, in the ID token, your services will have direct access. So they will just by deconstructing that JOT, they will see into that metadata. There's really fast libraries that do those, and it's sort of very standard industry practice. So it's easy peasy for R&D. Your onboarding, try to get it to be fully automated. For each environment, you have one way of doing that. They can be triggered by the customers themselves or by your administration, but try to have them unified so you are not in a position at some point wondering why is this slightly different than that, even though they were created just 5 minutes from each other. And there's no way that your onboarding mechanism would have had a new version in between. And then as you think about the resources that you provide in your onboarding, of course, then the tiering models come in. If you're providing that basic service, you might have the customer's data pooled. You might have they might be on a restricted resource usage. They might have their own quotas. But then if you go and have your customers willing to pay more, then you have that siloed, independent, and even beefed up environment where the customer can then run their workloads, and then manage that by configurations in the system for those onboardings or onboarding automation, so that it's just a question of, do I put here standard, silver, or gold, and then you're getting those environments, the templates that you've already defined to be used for that. And then as you start those, start to have new customers, new tenants, always start with the identity and onboarding. As you start to create new solutions, if you start thinking about, is this, would there be a new product in this, take your identity and onboarding as one of those first things that you think about after you solved your problem, proof of concept, you have it. Start immediately to incorporate your identity and onboarding mechanisms in, because then later on it is quite usually a bit more difficult to push them in. But if you have them at the start, it's much easier than to get to that level where everything is automated and you see things flowing smoothly. Thank you for your time.